While Tehran burns and the body counts rise on both sides of this war, there is a man in Moscow who hasn't fired a single shot. And he might be walking away with the biggest prize. Oil crossed $100 a barrel for the first time in years. The Strait of Hormuz effectively shut down. 20% of the world's oil supply stuck. And Vladimir Putin, who just months ago was being strangled by Western sanctions, is waking up every morning to a fuller treasury. According to a report published by Newsweek on March 12th, Russia has already raked in nearly $7 billion in fossil fuel revenues since the U.S. and Israel launched strikes against Iran on February 28th. That's roughly $590 million per day. This isn't luck. This is geopolitics working exactly the way it was designed to. For those patient enough to wait. Let's separate what we know from what's being claimed. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes against Iran in what the Pentagon called Operation Epic Fury. That is confirmed. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei died. His son, Mojtaba Khamenei, took power. On March 12th, in his first official statement, read on Iranian state television, the new supreme leader was direct. The Strait of Hormuz will remain closed. As a, quote, tool of pressure. His words. Confirmed. According to Lloyd's List Intelligence, a British maritime data firm, fewer than 77 ships have crossed the strait since the war began. In a normal 2-week period, that number would be over 1,200. The difference is not a statistic. The difference is a global energy crisis. Brent crude closed at over $103 a barrel on Friday, March 13th, an 11% surge in a single week. That is confirmed by CNN Business. And on March 12th, the U.S. Treasury published a temporary license suspending sanctions on Russian oil already at sea. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent posted the announcement publicly, describing it as a, quote, specific and short-term measure to stabilize global supply. That is on the record. What is still being disputed, the exact breakdown of Russia's revenues during this period. There is no official Russian figure. What exists are independent analyst estimates and a blunt assessment from the President of the European Council, Antonio Costa, who said on March 10th, "So far, there is only one winner in this war: Russia." To understand why Putin benefits, you need to understand where Russia was standing before February 28th. The war in Ukraine had been running for 4 years. Costs were mounting. Western sanctions had forced Russian oil to sell at a discount. Buyers existed, but they demanded lower prices to offset the political risk. Europe, which once imported more than 20% of its oil from Russia, had cut that figure down to 6%. Russia was bleeding. Slowly. Then the Strait of Hormuz closed. That strait is a 34-kilometer-wide choke point between the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, all of their exports flow through it. 1/5 of the world's oil, and nearly the same share of liquefied natural gas, pass through that narrow corridor every year. When Iran's Revolutionary Guard threatened to destroy any vessel attempting to cross, the global market didn't wait for proof. Prices spiked immediately, and the world started looking for alternatives. Russia is the second largest oil exporter on the planet. The math isn't complicated. Putin told his ministers and energy executives at a meeting this week that it was, quote, important for Russian energy companies to seize the current moment. Then, no diplomatic language, no hedging, just instruction. The Russian advantage in this conflict has four layers, and they work together. The first is financial. With oil above $100 a barrel, every tanker of Russian crude reaching India, China, or any Asian refinery is worth significantly more than it was in February. The sanctions relief granted by Trump's treasury is a bonus that the United States itself delivered to Moscow. The second is logistical. Iran is blocking Western-aligned shipping, but not all shipping. According to Lloyd's List intelligence, the vessels still crossing the strait include ships linked to Iran, Greece, and China. Russia has operated what analysts call a shadow fleet, vessels that move outside standard compliance frameworks, since 2022. That network is already in place. It doesn't need an invitation. The third is military. The United States is repositioning assets to the Persian Gulf. The Pentagon confirmed it is sending additional amphibious ships and thousands of Marines to the region. Every military resource pointed at Hormuz is a resource not pointed at Ukraine. Ukrainian President Zelensky has already warned publicly that Russia could use these new revenues to fund its war effort. That warning is not hypothetical. The fourth is diplomatic. Putin called Trump. Putin called the Iranian president. Putin is positioning himself as a mediator. While collecting the proceeds of the conflict he is supposedly trying to end. The Kremlin's spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, summarized Russia's position last week with a sentence that deserves to be repeated carefully. We have to secure our benefit whenever possible, no matter how cynical that may sound. 3 scenarios, ranked by likelihood. The most probable outcome is a prolonged war of attrition. Iran cannot defeat the United States and Israel in a conventional fight. It doesn't need to. Cheap drones, naval mines, asymmetric attacks on commercial shipping. Every week the strait remains choked is another week of elevated oil prices and Russian revenue. Mojtaba Khamenei has not appeared publicly since taking power. A sign of personal vulnerability. Yes, but also a sign that the Iranian system has not collapsed. This conflict could stretch for months. A negotiated settlement mediated by Moscow sits at medium probability. Trump has said the war will end soon. Multiple times. The gap between that statement and reality has been growing. If a diplomatic exit is needed, Putin is the one with lines open to both Tehran and Washington. He has already indicated he raised the subject in his call with Trump. A Kremlin-brokered peace is not impossible. But Moscow would extract a price, probably on Ukraine. A catastrophic escalation is the low-probability scenario that nobody wants to say out loud. The Pentagon says it has a plan to forcibly reopen Hormuz. Iran says it will intensify attacks. Defense Secretary Hegseth stated publicly on March 13th that the new Iranian supreme leader is, quote, wounded, probably disfigured. If Mojtaba Khamenei is killed or incapacitated, the Iranian power structure could fracture in ways no one can predict. That is not a scenario anyone controls. 3 things are not getting the attention they deserve. The first is the timing of the sanctions relief. The U.S. Treasury issued its license-easing restrictions on Russian oil on March the 12th. The same day, Brent crossed $100. The administration called it short-term and specific. Maybe it is, but the precedent now exists. The next renewal will be easier to justify politically, and the one after that, easier still. The second is that Iran is actually exporting more oil now than before the war started. While blocking Western-aligned tankers in the Strait, Tehran has maintained and reportedly expanded its own clandestine export network. The data firm Kepler confirmed this. The blockade is selective. It harms Iran's enemies and enriches Iran itself, which means the strait is less a desperate military act and more a calculated economic instrument. The third is the disappearance of Ukraine from the international conversation. 4 years of Russian invasion, and the coverage, the political attention, the military aid discussions have migrated to the Gulf almost entirely. That shift has real consequences for Kyiv. Zelensky knows it. Putin counted on it. What this war has made visible is something that rarely surfaces this clearly in the news cycle. Conflicts between mid-sized powers, even devastating ones, create space for third parties to extract value without paying a cost. Putin didn't have to choose a side. He didn't have to risk a soldier, a missile, or a diplomatic relationship. He just needed to have oil and the patience to wait for someone else's crisis. Iran resists with drones and mines. Israel bombs. Trump makes announcements. And Moscow opens the register. The question that no one in Washington, Tel Aviv, or Tehran seems to be asking right now is the simplest one of all. Who is paying the price of this war? And who is cashing the check?